Oh, robot voice.
That's part of what we paid for.
Yeah. So I think what we'll do, I want to wait a bit because we have, so theoretically, we have had about 160 people register to attend, which is quite a lot. And I imagine that they'll be getting in and getting them situated. So why don't we, since we don't have any streaming bossa nova music as background, why don't we go around and actually just introduce ourselves a little bit. We'll get this on video, and as folks stream in, we'll get started. Blaine, can I start with you?
Oh, I'm Blaine. I know some of the people on here. Jeremy. Yeah, I'm Blaine. I work for Condé Nast. I'll introduce myself a little bit on the talk, but yeah, I'm excited to be here with y'all.
And you're dialing in from the wilds of British Columbia.
Yeah, from the Columbia Mountains. Actually, not far from the Columbia River, just hundreds and hundreds of miles away from that part of the Columbia River.
Awesome. Well, let's go to the other end. Christina, that reference was, you were saying that you're in the Columbia River Gorge in Washington or in Oregon?
I'm on the Washington side of the river, but the river is the state line. So we shop in Oregon, and yeah. I'm a knowledge ecologist, so my background is wetland ecology, and I got interested in human coordination and organizations as living systems in very literal ways, like how are we literally living systems? And I'm really thrilled to be here. I know Jeremy from way back. I'm a giant fan of Gordon's, and very excited to meet Blaine and everybody else. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, let's go over to big fan Gordon. Who the heck are you and where are you?
I'm just some guy in Washington. I guess I'm a designer. I'm a software engineer. I'm a web person, so I spent my career at mostly at Mozilla, sometime over working on Chrome at Google. I've worked on 5 browsers and an operating system at this point, which is kind of ridiculous. And I recently struck out on my own to build something new, which is a kind of hypertext system for note taking. So I'm an avid note taker. I've worked on hypertext systems in the form of the web for a very long time. And I think I've spent most of my time trying to reform the web. And this is maybe an attempt to kind of build a new kind of distributed hypertext system with a lot of the properties of the web, but making a different set of trade-offs.
The new web. And you said you're in Washington State?
That's right, yeah. On one of the islands off the coast of Seattle.
Are you on Bainbridge or Orcas?
Sorry, not an actual island. I'm on the peninsula, Kitsap in Bremerton.
Amazing, amazing. I'm here in Vancouver, so a lot of us are very familiar with this coastal area between British Columbia and Washington State. Jeremy.
Hi, I'm in Oxford in the UK, where it's late afternoon on finally a nice summer's day. I guess I'm here because for a long time I've been working on a tool called TiddlyWiki, which is a very, what's the word? Well, in some respects, an unorthodox choice of a tool for thought, but it's been around for a long time. I'm really delighted to be here in this group because when you do this work, I think what we're doing is building software that in some sense fits around the human mind. And in some sense, we're all visualizing, therefore, given that we're all human, we're all sort of visualizing the same thing. But the second we sit down to make the kinds of choices that Gordon is making now, we close off possibilities. And it's very frustrating. The price of progress is not doing other things. But one of the things that I love about working in an area that has lots of fellow practitioners is it feels like collectively we're all exploring the space really well, even though individually, necessarily our journeys are sort of individual and cranky old things that chance and happenstance sets us up for. And I'm very grateful to Boris for making such a concerted effort to bring this community of interest together. And I always find these kinds of sessions a great pleasure. So thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, my pleasure. Absolutely. So introducing myself, I'm Boris Mann. I'm in East Vancouver on the north end of Commercial Drive, being very specific. And I'm the founder of Fission. I will tell you a little bit about it. Jeff is also on the Fission team as the head of product, and he'll talk a little bit about how we think about why Fission cares about tools for thought and how we might fit into that. Jeff, briefly, where are you?
I'm in East Vancouver at the south end of Commercial Drive, so not that far away. At one point we were drawing like a triangle on the map between Brooke, myself, and Boris. It's mostly like a 90-degree angle between me and Brooke, and then Boris. Then there's the long edge. So yeah, I joined Fission very recently, and I'm still in sort of the fire hose part of trying to figure out all the things that we do, but I'm very excited to be here. Like Gordon, I spent quite a while at Mozilla and worked on 3 different browsers, so not as many, and didn't really work on the operating system. So, but done a lot of stuff on the web over the years, and just been delighted to meet people like Gordon and Jeremy so far, and understand more about how specifically Tools for Thought thinks about decentralized applications and then how we might help.
Awesome. James is also here up in panelist land on the Fission team. Can you please intro yourself?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I am in Toronto, Canada, so somewhere between the West Coast heavy crew and Jeremy across the ocean. Yeah, I've been on the Fission team for well, it's over 6 months, but not quite a year. So somewhere in the middle there, and helping out with what we call developer success. So basically helping people build stuff on the Fission platform, which you'll hear more about. And I'll mostly be helping with moderation and answering questions here today.
Great. So I think what we are going to do is we are going to go ahead and get started. Theoretically, up to 100 more people might come in. Jury, your question. No, you can't see the crowd. We've had to move to webinar mode for this event. Jury has been a longtime attendee of Fission's Thursday Tech Talks, which is the slot that we're using. And we usually have a few less people and keep it a little more open. So we'll see how this goes in webinar mode. David asks, will the recording be available? Absolutely. We'll post it to our Vimeo account and cross-post it to YouTube, and generally make that available. If anyone has things to share, I know a lot of us hang out on the Twitter sphere, hashtag Tools for Thought, and we'll be doing a follow-up with links and additional resources to everyone who registered by email. The Fission forum, where the agenda and additional notes for this are posted, is also a good spot where you can just drop in and leave a comment and leave links to additional resources. And I think at the end, we'll also talk a little bit about how this community of practice might, in fact, continue to work together. So we've definitely got one more event that is on the same topic next week at a different time zone. Jury, does that answer your question with your raised hand? It does. I got the hand to go down. Fantastic. Thank you. Let's get started. So we've just gone ahead for those have been following along. We went through and we had everyone briefly introduce themselves. Sorry, James, you're not listed on the big screen here. We love you all the same. This is the agenda part. So we'll go through, Jeff will literally have one slide, which will just take a minute or so, and we won't pause for Q&A on that. Blaine is going to have about 20 or 30 minutes and have kind of the big overview of atJSON. And then Jeremy, Gordon, and Christina will go for about 10 minutes. What we'll do is we'll pause after each section and have about 5 minutes of Q&A. So what I hope to do is continue to have questions and time at the end for taking more questions and bringing people up on stage. Please do use the Q&A feature. So questions, comments, stash things there. That'll really help us stay organized and capture things so that we can all see them. Go ahead and ask those questions along the way. We won't really be pausing. I might be doing a little emceeing and redirect speakers, but otherwise we'll want to have them share what they have to say. And then go ahead and at the end of the session, feel free to use raise hand if you have something germane. But the best thing to do is, in fact, just to put it in the Q&A, because then we can see it. This all is being recorded. And we'll share video and notes by email to attendees who are on the Luma registration, and otherwise make sure to make it freely available. Any panelists or anyone else have questions, comments before we get started? Perfect. I am going to hand it over to Jeff.
Great, thanks, Boris. Mic check. You can hear me, right? Great. So again, I'm Jeff. I recently joined as head of products. I have to admit, when Boris started talking about TFT, or tools for thought, and when he used the acronym, I thought he meant NFT. So it took a little explaining. But then he traced that back to things like TiddlyWiki, and it made a lot more sense to me. And so when we think about tools for thought, we think it's a great use case for the kinds of building blocks that Fission has been working on over the last couple of years. Just as a reminder, if you're not aware, this is your first exposure to what Fission does. We're building on top of IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, as a global collaborative file system. So public and private data linked by content addresses and versioned. What we're doing is we're bringing this to the browser, so not just desktop browsers that use extensions, but any browser without extensions, mobile browsers. And we're focusing also on identity, meaning decentralized IDs or DIDs. And so the idea here is, and this is very much in line with how I think of tools for thought now, is that the data is user-centric. It's not stored on cloud servers to be data mined by large companies. It is instead encrypted and private for users themselves or to be shared. So right now, what you see when you go to fission.codes, which is our website, is you can create apps and you can get subdomains, and there's some DNS automation. And we're really excited about the next few steps for the product, which is more of a multiplayer sharing sort of capability, collaborative editing, these kinds of features, and a data log inspired decentralized database, which will really power move us beyond files. So not just files. Files are an amazing start, but move more towards almost a GraphQL kind of style database, and people can just really start building more interesting applications that way. If you have any questions about this, I don't think we're going to stop for questions now, but please drop by our Discord. So if you go to fission.codes, you should have all the information on the website to join the Discord, join the community, and ask questions there. And back to you, Boris.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And now I'm going to hand it over to Blaine.
Hello. Let me see here. This is the first time I've done one of these like this. Oops. Share sound. Good. There we go. Uh-oh. The Mac is asking for permission. see it? Excellent, very good. Hello, thanks Boris and Vision for hosting this. This feels really awesome. It's the first time I've spoken to more than 5 people at once in like 18 months. So that's exciting. But also we were talking, just the various panelists were introducing themselves, and it feels like kind of a food camp or a bar camp or something. It's been a long time since I think I've been in a group of really interesting people talking about the same thing. So that's fun. Anyhow, I'm Blaine. I do stuff on the internet. Currently I work at Condé Nast, which is a big publisher. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later, but this talk is about a thing that we've been working on kind of on and off. I think I've been working on it in some sense for about 8 years, called atJSON. It's kind of a weird name, but let's get into it. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the motivations for atJSON, like what were the problems that we were trying to address. So let's talk about Markdown. Markdown is pretty ubiquitous in our world, and sort of most relevantly, so I said I work at Condé Nast, so these are some of our brands, and we publish all of this content online, and as part of a recent round of digital transformation, the developers made a reasonable decision to just use Markdown for all of the brands. So, thankfully the New Yorker employees didn't actually have to type Markdown into the website, but everyone else did. And it makes sense as like a, agile rapid development kind of thing. But one of the problems with Markdown is that there's not like this idea that all this common mark content is common. It's a lie. Because actually there were a bunch of different variants of the common mark that they had across the different brands. So each of these brands used, slightly different variants. So for example, my favorite example is like GQ used block quotes to represent like, an inline quote, and a pull quote to represent a thing that would sit outside the text and was kind of like a feature quote. Wired did the opposite. And so at some point we were like unifying all of the front end CMSs because each of these were separate applications. And when we did that, we had to normalize all of this content. And it was a real pain in the butt because it's really complicated. And this is like horror land, but like every Unicode string is a valid Markdown document, which is just terrible because parsing is actually pretty easy, and Markdown parsers are terrible, let me tell you. But inferring meaning is really hard. So if you think that parsing Markdown is hard, inferring meaning is basically impossible.
But Blaine, just one note, you've got a gray square in the top left that you may have a window over top of something.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, thank you. Thanks for letting me know. So yeah, so this is a real problem. This problem is not unique to Condé Nast. For each of these different variants of Markdown, I guarantee you that there are uncountable different ways that the actual data is used, that the semantics are mangled. But I think Werner Herzog said it best.
Taking a close look at what's around us, there is some sort of a harmony. It is the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder. When I say this all full of admiration for the jungle. It is not that I hate it. I love it. I love it very much, but I love it against my better judgment.
So I feel very similar to Werner. Like, it's amazing that we have so much diversity. It's also horrible, collective murder. So people have been trying to solve this problem, and I think a lot of people probably in the audience are among the people building these tools. So this idea of blocks is something that's really gained prominence recently. So let's see here, is it playing? There we go. So WordPress has the new Gutenberg editor, which is a block-based editor. Notion has their blocks. There's a really good blog post about that recently. And there's literally 1,000 different editors that take this approach. But I want to take a step back and talk about one of the other motivations for atJSON and where we're coming from before going further into the block stuff. Excuse me. So I had a startup 8 years ago now. How does time go so quickly? Called Poetica. And really atJSON is an extraction from Poetica, but what we were trying to do was this, right? This is what editors do. And the editorial process isn't something that fits neatly into some, into these blocks. It's messy, it's complicated, it's extremely expressive. So this is what Poetica looked like. It wasn't quite so messy. We wanted it to be messier. But one of the hard requirements that we had for Poetica was that the ability for paragraphs and annotations, comments, and formatting to all overlap. So we didn't want to be constrained by this idea that you have this strict hierarchy of content. We wanted you to be able to just say what you meant and communicate directly, human to human, not mediated by some data structure, basically. Because really, when we talk about hierarchies are really useful. And I think Engelbert wrote about this and talked about hierarchies extensively. But the reality is there's more than one hierarchy on a piece of content. And these hierarchies are complicated and they're interrelated and they're just messy. They don't fit into these strict sort of linear hierarchical forms. So that's kind of where we're starting from. So we've got this trying to wrangle Markdown and trying to really think about how ideas really work and how humans communicate about ideas. So that's sort of where we get into atJSON. And really it's simple. So it's a format. It's not a standard because I've gone down those mines and I can't even. But basically it breaks down into two parts. We've got content, which is just, we can debate the specific semantics, but a JavaScript string for lack of a better definition, a Unicode string. And then annotations on that string. And that's just an array, just really, really simple. Each annotation has a type with a namespace, a start and an end offset that indexes into the string, and some arbitrary attributes. And that's really it. That's the whole thing in terms of the format. And what we found is that this is incredibly useful. So it's an approach to separating the semantics from the content. And so we all understand how CSS separates style from form with HTML. And so we can extract the visual style so we don't have to encode it in the HTML document. So hopefully our HTML semantics can be richer and more explicit and everything. Frankly, I don't think that works, but atJSON is an approach of separating the semantics from the content. So we just decouple those things. And now we can have different layers of semantics, just like we can have different visual styles that kind of overlay. We can have all of these different semantics that refer to the text, but aren't interleaved and intertwined with the text. atJSON is also a set of tools. So it's a mostly TypeScript library to work with these annotated documents, because once you separate the content and the semantics, those offsets, you need to be able to adjust them when you change the text. So there's just a few little library functions that do that. So we can insert text, we can remove text, add annotations, remove annotations. And in terms of like actually manipulating documents, this is really the whole API. I went looking to see if there were other things, and this is it. So we do need this to be able to manipulate these documents. It's also, we've got a few sort of utility tools on top of that. So we have this tool set called the hierarchical intermediate representation, which is just a way of translating these annotations into hierarchical formats. We have a lot of hierarchical formats. If you want to render HTML or React or Markdown or anything like that, you have to have a tree that you can render from. So we found that useful enough that we've sort of built this general purpose thing to do this transformation. And I just want to, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but down the HELLOWRLD string down there, I think really illustrates how far we are from the content when we're dealing with hierarchical formats. So if you look at the content attribute over in the atJSON format, it says hello world, and you can see what it is, and you can see what that content is. In the hierarchical form, it's spread across all of these different parts of the tree. And so I think that's a nice illustration that I wanted to point out. But let's see here. atJSON also has this relational algebra. So I kind of describe this as like if SQL met XSLT, but with what I think is a reasonable syntax. But this is for defining converters or like manipulating documents. So once you have all of these semantics, how do you reason about them? How do you work with them? How do you manipulate them? So I'll just really briefly talk through. So if you wanted to convert a Google Docs format to, we have like this Rosetta format. This is just how you convert links. Or part of how you convert links. So we first find all of the underlined, like the underline annotations. So in Google Docs, it's this TS_un thing that they call it. We call those underlines. We do the same thing for links. And then we join them together by finding all of the annotations that are sort of aligned. So with concordant start and end positions. And then we just remove that underline because Google Docs basically has both the formatting of the underline and the link separately. And so we want to just say, no, these are just links. The formatting doesn't matter to us. So we do this kind of thing a lot. And it turns out it's a really useful, rich way to reason about content and whatnot. And then we have some other utility tools to help with modeling. So we have this concept of a source. So this is like a format. So we can basically map we haven't found something that we haven't been able to map, but like a content format to like a set of annotations. So like we have an HTML source that's defined from the HTML spec. It auto-generates and creates annotations for all different HTML types, element types and attributes and everything. And then we can take any parsed HTML document and convert it into the annotated form. A renderer, which is usually using that hierarchical stuff that I was talking about. And these are just utility classes to like help output content into like usually a string or something. So HTML, React, Markdown, that sort of thing. Converters, which we saw on the last slide, sort of how you map one schema to another. So if you wanted to transform HTML to Markdown? Like, what are the set of functions that you would need to apply to HTML to get it to be Markdown, basically? And then we have a bunch of predefined sources. So we've got one for Common Mark, Google Docs. Google Docs has a weird internal format that if you copy, it's in the paste buffer. CK Editor, which is what we use as the rich text editor internally in Conde, and we do a bunch of stuff with atJSON in there. Mobile Doc, Prism, which is a XML format for publishing content like magazine layout stuff, WordPress, shortcodes, and so on. And then we have these Rosetta annotations that I mentioned. We call it offset. So it's basically just a set of like common sort of abstract annotations. So things like bold or italic or paragraph, or, you know, like these sort of like these core concepts that are kind of invariant across different formats. So we have a bunch of annotations there. And really what we use that for is when we define converters from, say, HTML to Markdown, what we do is, excuse me, instead of defining a converter from HTML to Markdown, we have a converter from HTML to offset, and then we have a way to render offset into Markdown so that we don't have to do an end-to-end number of converters. We can just do formats to offset and vice versa. And it reduces the number that we have to do there. So this is what converting a document looks like using atJSON. So this is actually like slightly cleaned up, but actually only the names have been changed to protect the innocent. We do this for all of the content that we have at Condé Nast. We convert from, should actually back up a little bit and I have a little bit of time. It's a lot of content to go through in 20 minutes. So, so we have all of these different formats, the ones that I mentioned earlier, the like GQ specific common mark and the Vogue specific common mark and the Wired specific common mark. So we have parsers and converters for each of those. And all of our content, because we didn't want to do like a stop the world bulk migrate everything, we just tagged all of the content as what type of content it was. And then when we render stuff to the CMS, like to the front end, we just do an on the fly translation of that to our common Markdown format, so that we don't need to do a gigantic conversion. It also lets us do incremental conversions, so we can improve our understanding over time. So we can support some things, but not everything. So I'll talk through this a little bit. So we start with our original document. So we take the raw Markdown content, and we end up with this original atJSON document. That's the annotation version of the Markdown document. And then we convert that to our CMS, like our common shared understanding document, and we get this atJSON document that's like all of the common annotations. And then, sorry, I've been massively dehydrated. Excuse me. So then we render that to our specific Condé Markdown. And we get this generated Markdown. Excuse me. So we get this generated Markdown. And then we reparse that Markdown into an atJSON document. So we have this original document that's the atJSON annotations for the original Markdown. We've gone sort of this round trip to this shared version. And then we've got all of these annotations of the shared version. And if the original one equals the generated one, then we know that we understand everything about that document, because we can convert everything with full fidelity into like from A to B, which turns out is really, really useful. And it's maybe useful to point out here that for a given text, we can create a canonical set of annotations, but there are a bunch of different like valid but equal but unequal markdown or HTML representations of the same text. So you can, like, if you imagine in Markdown, the trivial example is like put in a few extra spaces and it's the same document, but they're different. And so by converting them to annotations, we can actually tell if the documents are the same, because there's this sort of canonicalization process that we can do much, much more easily than trying to parse and then canonicalize Markdown. So with the semantic diff, what we then have is we can diff the annotations, and we can know exactly which features from the original content we didn't support because they got dropped along the way. And so that allows us to do this sort of incremental migration where, you know, if we didn't parse some attribute on like a video, like a caption for a video, that would get dropped and we would be able to sort of detect that. So anyways, that was probably really confusing, but hopefully that made sense to some folks. So I want to go back to these motivations and just take a step back and talk a little bit about why I think atJSON is interesting, and this sort of annotation approach. So in the 1970s, in the late 60s, Charles Goldfarb and et al. Came up with this GML, which is Goldfarb, Mosher, Laurie, but a generalized markup language. And it was the first semantic markup language. And it was invented in a time when hard drives were, you know, the size of small cars, and slow and linear. And, you know, there were a bunch of reasons that interspersing these they were macros originally to expand into like instructions for a printer to lay out this stuff. Given the set of tools, this made a lot of sense. But then that became SGML and HTML and XML. And then someone had the bright idea that we should make HTML simpler, called it Markdown. And it turns out that they reinvented something from the 1960s, almost verbatim, except with less semantics. And I really worry that we're kind of stuck in a rut at this point. We don't, you know, we kind of went down this conceptual path, and there's a whole bunch that's really hard to do, that's really hard to express, and I feel, and having played with atJSON in practice for a while, I think there's actually a lot that we can unlock by shifting things up. I also want to go back to that blocks example. So this is blocks implemented in atJSON with you know, Notion, Rome, and TiddlyWiki content all intermixed. So, you know, I think this hopefully illustrates a little bit, like, you know, sometimes data models really do matter. And the way that we think about our content and our data really does change how we approach problems. And, you know, the Notion thing here, the content there, we can have sub documents. So the content inside there could be an atJSON document itself. So you get all of the nice sort of graph properties of a lot of the stuff that people are doing with blocks, but in this super flexible way that can be interspersed with text, can be interspersed with different things, like different formats and whatnot, and you get, like, you know, the relational algebra that I was talking about, and just I don't know, there's a lot to explore there. So just wanted to sort of throw that out there. And I'll point out, just for point of interest, because the people watching this are probably nerds. Until a few years ago, I didn't know that Unicode had this character, but it's an object replacement character. It's right there. It's sitting there for us. It was right there. So I would be remiss not to talk a little bit about the downsides of atJSON. So the first is that you need a rich text editor. You're not going to be editing this by hand. I mean, you could, but that would be painful. This is really something that we need a tool to help us edit. Having worked with editors and writers for a long time, that's not actually a downside. I think programmers, we like Markdown, it's great, it's easy to type. Everyone else hates it, like just with the passion of 1,000 burning suns. They find it really confusing. You basically have to understand HTML to use Markdown. And I think, using star as a shorthand makes a lot of sense, but people want tools that support their thought, and those are rich text editors. And with a rich text editor, we can do all of this annotation stuff. The other downside is that the tooling is really, really early. There have been a handful of people who've worked on the atJSON tools. We've built them for really specific use cases. It's kind of a side project within Conde. So there's a lot, it's like ROF, pre-trof, and grof, and rof, and all of those tools. We're not even at the sort of HTML level, even HTML1 level of tooling here. So I just wanted to be upfront about that. But I think being able to have different views on data is super, super powerful. And there are a lot of people working on this stuff. There's been definitely an uptick, like Ian at Codex with he calls annotation standoff. And there's a lot out there that I definitely did not have time to put in this talk. But I think it's an interesting space to watch anyways. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope that all made sense. Cheers.
Amazing. So panelists, this is jazz hands instead of applause. Thank you so much, Blaine. That was fantastic. We have a ton of questions, so I'll just go through them one at a time from top to bottom. Bill Seitz asked, aren't there effectively potentially overlapping annotations? Doesn't that break hierarchy?
So we use a yes, but no. So we use a rank, like there's a sort. So like paragraphs always go before bold, for example, and that's just defined in the semantics of your format. So when we create the hierarchy, paragraphs would always contain bolds, but if there's a bold that crosses two paragraphs, we would just insert the bold into both of those paragraphs. We've had some pretty complicated situations, and it actually works really well for what it's worth. Can definitely discuss that more, of course, but.
How does Brian James Rubinton from Canopy asked, how does atJSON differ from other structured text editor toolkits such as Prose Mirror?
So it's really it's this annotation centric approach. So Notion, Prose Mirror, all of them have this, they ultimately you kind of have to have this concept of marks, which are the bold kind of setup. Which covers part of text. And we just went full bore with it. So we said, look, we don't need blocks. We don't need, these different chunks of content. We can represent all of that just with the annotations. So I think that's the main difference. It's a little bit abstract, but there's a lot of subtleties here. So I don't know how much detail I can get into.
Marc-Antoine Parent asks, what happens when you insert at an intersection boundary? So slightly similar to what was asked before, but I think more nuanced.
Yeah, one of the things that we have is this concept of, what is it? What is it even called? Boundary behaviors. So this is one of my favorite things about, like, kind of built too many text editors using HTML at this point. And one of the expectations that, like the user expectations are really interesting. So if you insert text at the end of a hyperlink, the expectation is that the text that you insert will not extend the hyperlink, like it'll not be contained within the hyperlink. If you insert text at the end of a bold, the expectation is that the bold will extend. And so the behavior of like how you modify the annotations is actually dependent on the annotation. And so we have some tooling to handle that, that sort of case. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Does the Ethan Plant ask, does the decoupling of semantics and content work in Markdown and block structures? Could it just be layered on top?
Yes, yeah. So I think we need to, I do think that you need to separate, like you actually need a physical separation of the semantics to get these properties. I don't think that there's a way to do this inline in the text, because then you end up with these sort of overlapping structures that become virtually impossible to parse. And there's a few, like just the way that we conceptualize about things. You know, you could model everything as self-closing spans with IDs. So you have like a start span and you have an end span. But then those two spans are related. And then you have to reason about how they're related. And so I think this approach of like just moving everything out, saying, here's an annotation, it's got some semantic properties, and it applies to this text, actually just makes it easier to think about a lot of these problems than trying to model it in Markdown or in a block or anything like that.
I think probably the mental model that a lot of people have is, I have my favorite text editor and I'm doing this, but this is where the rich text or using an app comes in. Mm-hmm. You know, you could store Markdown. And I think that's some of our topics around interchange, right? We wanted to start with atJSON to go like, look, here's a candidate that could mix and match between these things. It's not really important in export, but it can be. Mm-hmm. And so how do we interchange things without losing semantic detail? Between tools of different fidelity. And indeed, the way that we model the like text editors, so we have a CK editor implementation where basically we've modified CK editor, so its internal data model is atJSON, and then that gets converted into the rendering pipeline that CK editor uses to update its sort of DOM. And then all of the events that CK editor fires get converted back into atJSON, and then back into the DOM model. It turns out it's ridiculously fast to do this, so it's not a performance problem, but it gives us a bunch of ways to reason about what's happening with the text editor that we wouldn't have traditionally had. So I think I mentioned in passing, like videos with captions. Modeling that in an editor is really complicated, actually. It's a really complicated thing because in the HTML version, you have sort of like a div and then a video inside and then a caption tag, or there's a bunch of different ways that you can model that. When we reason about it in our rich text editor, that is sadly not open source, I'm working on it. We just have a video that has a caption property, and then how that gets rendered is kind of besides the point, to be honest. So that makes this stuff a lot easier. So. Flancian asked, how does atJSON relate to the web annotation standard and model? It seems to have at least some overlap, like the text position selector.
Mm-hmm. So you can definitely do this with the W3C stuff. I have thoughts. It's good. It's just kind of complicated, to be honest. I think it's a bit overwrought, and this is just an easier way. I find it easier to think about it in this way. It's sort of like, you can render, you can model everything in JSON using XML, and the reality is we don't. So
I think there's a good point here to be made. Again, you know, I really wanted Blaine to present. The work has been going on in solving real problems at Condé Nast, and even some phrases on the README around 100-year document format is something I think which resonates with tools for thought. And this is coming from the like, no, we're trying to do this. We're not trying to be a large consortium of entities creating a standard. And there's tension between that, especially with how quickly the tools for thought movement is happening right now. So let's work on running code.
Yeah.
And we'll work on rough consensus as working open source software. I'm doing call outs to a bunch of other things like standards processes there, which we can dig into. Ethan asks, how's the performance? I think like, can this use real time? I think Blaine already answered that. Basically, the answer is yes, CK Editor can be used real time in a browser. So you could certainly do it in a native app of various kinds. Gordon, I expect a Swift implementation on my desk by Monday. Thank you very much. Peter Wasilko asks, have you taken a look at functional optics libraries like partial lenses?
Is this like the Cambria stuff? No, different. I'm not sure then. No, that's interesting.
I think he dropped a link, so we'll
okay, cool.
We'll make sure that gets looked at. And this is the exact kind of thing where at the end of this, everyone that you see here who's interested will get into some sort of forum, GitHub discussion format where we can talk more about this. Mark Antoine, does the toolkit include an HTML editor widget other than CK Editor for native atJSON documents?
There have been experiments, not currently. Yeah, we built a web component editor. Its build is currently very broken. And last week, some unrelated stuff, I adapted Slate JS to use atJSON as its sort of interchange format. So it's definitely possible. But yeah, this is one of the tools are early.
Ethan, and I'm going to use he's got two questions, so I'll kind of ask them both again. Could the decoupling of semantics and content work in apps that use a block structure? Could it just be layered on top? And then how difficult would be allow for image, audio, and video annotation?
So one of the reasons that that the attribute that contains the text is called content is because we've thought about, that content could be a URL to a video. And I kind of glossed over, there's also like a content type attribute. And so this offset, like the start end position model works natively with video because you have start and end positions and audio. For images, you can have X and Y. For 3D objects, you can have X, Y, and Z. Like this, I think this model scales to lots of different content types. We haven't built any of that. It's just sort of like, in theory, you could do this, and that would be cool, is about as far as we've gotten. But it's definitely one of the motivating factors for approaching it this way was like, there was that really nice conceptual mapping. I've also thought a little bit about actually modeling PDF using this stuff. So you would have it's basically PDF inverted. So you have the text and then you annotate it with the positions of the characters and the layout. And rather than the way the PDF does it, which is like the positions and then the text. So you could have, an annotation document, visual document format of some sort. So,
yep. One more question and then we'll move on to Jeremy. How is this similar and different from Codex's standoff annotation?
Ian and I had a chat actually with Boris about a month and a half ago, and we were like, oh, we built the same thing. It is exactly the same, almost to the dot. So we call it different things, but it's, it's extremely similar.
So I think that's really one of the questions of bringing this together and the motivation. And Ian, he's in Australia, so this time zone doesn't work for both Europe and Australia. So we'll have him next week. And ideally, Sam Klein says essential convergence. So ideally what we will do is have multiple people who are interested in working on this. So the tools are early, will also get solved by the fact that many people want the same thing, and it makes sense for us to work on this stuff together. Public and common goods, which is a topic I talk about. Hey, once again, a round of applause and chat smileys for Blaine. Thank you so much. That was super fantastic. Yes, time check. So this is going to go long. We've got 3 more talks that are going to be about 10 minutes each. And so I'll hand it over to Jeremy and we'll keep rolling. We can go long, so we'll see how long we can go going as well. Take it away, Jeremy.
That's great. Thank you, Boris. And thank you, Blaine. I've really enjoyed finding out about atJSON recently, but it was great to see you presenting it. And I think maybe there's a theme here that you ended with, which was talking about Ian's work, Codex editor, as some of us know him, and it's convergent evolution. You've converged on the atJSON thing, which I'd like to propose a way of thinking about that chimes with my work, is to think of it as a flattening of hierarchical structures. I guess you used words not dissimilar to that. And it seems that that's the interesting thing here, is that we know that there's this sort of appeal of hierarchical structures, and there are some places where those have worked really well. But then we find there are kinds of computation and manipulation that work much better if you can flatten those hierarchical structures to essentially a stream of things. And I think the atJSON work is a lovely illustration of that principle, if something as blunt as flattening could be a principle. So I was going to, Blaine's already covered a lot of the things that I think I wanted us to bring up and discuss. It's how that we face a bit of a quandary that from a distance you can see that all of these tools for thought share some key characteristics in common. They're all text-based. They're all based around chunks of text and have principal or blocks or tiddlers, whatever we call them. And they all use double square brackets for links. And so from a distance, it does seem like there's this massive opportunity. And yet, as soon as you dig in, as Blaine did, these tools have concepts like tagging. And to take tagging as an example, in TiddlyWiki, a tiddler, a block, has metadata. And one of those metadata fields is a list of tags that applies to that tiddler. So the tags are extrinsic to the tiddler. Whereas in Rome research, one of the fascinating things that they've done that's to me is a real innovation in the space is to, well, they still have metadata behind the scenes, but to de-emphasize that and to make linking be the means by which tagging is achieved. So there's a sort of, in a smoky room, you can see the similarities, but as soon as you turn the lights on, you get so disconcerted by all these lumpy differences. And I think this happens at every level, even the deepest level. TiddlyWiki and Rome research, both at their core, have a sophisticated query language that allows you to, to query their data stores. And Rome's query language is essentially closure, and TiddlyWiki has invented its own weird system of monad chains, which work beautifully in TiddlyWiki, and they're sort of, they're just things with parameters that happen after other, excuse me, happen after other things. So even at this, what seems like the most arcane, complicated part of the problem, the structure of the relationships between items, and how we query that. There is there's this tantalizing set of similarities. I think atJSON feels, thanks to that convergent evolution, feels to a lot of us like it might be part of the solution, because obviously right now, TiddlyWiki documents, the markup is inline, just like Markdown or HTML. And that really is an impediment to interchange. So it does seem clear that adopting atJSON or something similar would give us a basic end user expectation of plain text being transferred with high fidelity.
So in TiddlyWiki, for those that don't know it, you have essentially your own TiddlyWiki markup
Yes.
as a native format.
Indeed. Let me screen share. So TiddlyWiki's thing is it takes, it's pretty much in the 1970s in Blaine's evolution of systems. It takes, the idea that it takes from wikis is the idea of making links easy to type. So I always loved this idea of making linking be part of the punctuation of writing. So like lots of tools, I can write a link. In TiddlyWiki's case, it supports, TiddlyWiki supports what's called camel case, which again, very 1970s, makes a link automatically, but I can also make a link in the traditional way like that. So TiddlyWiki has that kind of markup, and it has, formatting that despite the toolbar, it actually does traditional Markdown-like formatting. But TiddlyWiki's thing is that it makes the markup language is rich enough to express the entire user interface. So everything that you see here, including things that can be quite complicated, are all composed in wiki text. And that means that end users can click edit to see how anything is done. There's a view source effect, and build their own things. And so TiddlyWiki, for that reason, the TiddlyWiki ecosystem is full of things that look typically very different than TiddlyWiki itself. So here is an adaptation of TiddlyWiki that uses the same components as TiddlyWiki, but presents them in this other view. So forgive me. So that's one of the challenges with TiddlyWiki, is its markup language is incredibly, sorry, show you the right things at the right time. Its markup language is very, very rich. And so that expressiveness, it's simply not a goal for other systems that aren't trying to let people build these kinds of customized applications. So part of what TiddlyWiki believes is that everybody's needs for note-taking are different, and the best way for us to cater for everybody's needs is through customization. And the best way for us to make sure that people can have a customized wiki that suits them is for the tool to be open source and for the community to exchange things. So it's going to very quickly show you a thing that I've been working on that annoyingly for a little while without knowing about atJSON. So this is kind of showing you something that I think would be very different if I'd been influenced by atJSON when I started. And it's not too late, which is why it's a good time to see it and talk about it. And it's doing something that I think a lot of us have thought about with these tools for thoughts. Tools for thought, toys for thought, as somebody coined in the chat earlier. And it's a system for importing ePUBs into, in this case, TiddlyWiki, into a tool for thought. So the idea is that I can open a column with a book in it, and I can navigate around that book and sort of read it like you would a normal ePUB. And I can make annotations, and the annotations are expressed as links. So this is, I might here say, this is something interesting I found. Sorry, with screencast typing, hope you don't mind that. And then I'll write my interesting thought about the interesting thing. and the chunk of the book with the annotation is expressed as a link between these two tiddlers. And I can open lots of them at the same time, which is something, what I'm interested in is not when you read a book for the first time, it's when you read a book for the second time, when you're really trying to get something out of it. I think lots of people use this phrase, active reading, the idea that particularly on the second reading, the process of reading a book is a process of slicing and dicing the bits that you want to keep out of it, and making your own notes around its structure. And so this, by allowing you to bring in multiple books, and we can go crazy and have lots of them, allows us to really stretch browsers. So again, there's a theme here about we're all the beneficiaries of massive performance gains. That this is an absurd amount of data rolling around in a Chrome tab, and it works just fine. And amazingly, we got some adjustability, so you can sort of change the sizes of columns and things. And a very surprising thing is it actually works quite well on mobile. So if I go into fake mobile phone mode and give it a chance to refresh, you can swipe between columns on mobile. And you get this quite nice experience where as I scroll through one column, it's retained my position in the adjacent column. So behind the scenes, sorry, let me go to that so you can see it a little bit more clearly. Everything I've shown you here is a TiddlyWiki with some tools for viewing these converted publications. Behind the scenes, there's a Node.js script which converts the ePUBs, and it's something that I think probably any of us could have done, probably a bunch of us have tried to do in the past. It's just a matter of running up Puppeteer, you bring in the HTML pages of the ePUB, you intercept the request that it makes. And it's stuff that's kind of, in developer land, that stuff's being commoditized and it's quite easy and accessible to do it. The hard part was figuring out how to cut the document up into chunks, because as we know, these little mini HTML documents have weird structures. And then if you actually look at the actual ePUBs in the wild, they've all got mistakes and misnested tags and syntax errors and so on. So doing that robustly, the way that I've done it, I can show you, let me refresh and just get one thing. I'm going to show you this so that Blaine can laugh about it, I think. And it's, so here I'm going to just make a little annotation, and in doing so, I've actually made a copy of that chunk of the publication, and that makes it easy for me to then find it in a list so that we could look at the source of it, and that's what it looks like. So there's some stuff that I chuck onto it, a TiddlyWiki thing to make the annotations work. And that's a general purpose TiddlyWiki component that can annotate content, a class so that we can scope the CSS that came with the document. One of the things we do is process the CSS. I'm sure you do very similar things, Blaine, and pick out the CSS properties that we're interested in, because some publications mark bold text through a CSS class with bold attached to it. Absolute bonkers stuff. And then this, the rest of it, with all the closings, is the original HTML out of the book, except that we open and then close again any of the tags that span the block. And so that's the flattening process that we do. It means that CSS still works because preface, is still a child of book front matter. But of course, it means that we've made multiple copies of things. So there is we talked about a convergent evolution. There is what may well turn out to be an evolutionary dead end as I continue to work on this. But for the moment, even what I've got has given us a great opportunity to play with. As I say, something I think we've all always thought about: what would notes and books be like if they were kind of the same thing? So I'm sorry, Boris, I probably overshot, but that was my very quick intro. Thank you very much.
That's positively sparse from a Jeremy style. That was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure to see TiddlyWiki. I've dropped some links in. That's live on the web, and you can literally download that entire HTML file and then run it again. So and I see someone dropped a source there. So I think what I want to also do is pause and say, okay, great. Who wants to work on ePUB to atJSON? We do that once, and then that can be done by many different things. Ideally, is something that can work both in browsers and with Node.js as the starting point. People are welcome to do in many other different aspects. And that's how we start building up an ecosystem where tools for thought can start working with each other. So one version, and then Jeremy potentially can take his bespoke stuff and focus on the atJSON to Tiddly markup only, which is the handedness of his tool, right? Any questions for Jeremy, including panelists, if any panelists have questions or comments? Great. We will keep it moving because we have lots to cover still. Thank you again so much, Jeremy. And we will bring up Gordon. You are muted.
All right. Sorry about that. Jeremy, I just wanted to say it's phenomenal to watch you modify TiddlyWiki in real time. This is like a very beautiful property of a certain kind of software that is not so common anymore. Like my sense is like this deep divide between users and developers is a thing which has emerged around the current business model of software. And it's beautiful to see a tool that sort of maps back to something like the wiki or something like Unix pipes. It's like a Minecraft vision of software where everything is yours, or a Smalltalk vision of software where you can modify anything you please. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen here. I wanted to offer like a couple things before I get started here. One is that I want to bracket all of this and say that it's very experimental. So I have been building a Tools for Thought client for a couple of months now. It's kind of in like a prototypey stage. These ideas, I would say, are in a sort of prototyping phase. They are influenced by 10 years of note-taking and like 12,000 personal notes in a folder somewhere in a variety of formats. So treat it as food for thought. The other thing I'd say is that I'm about to share a radically different set of trade-offs for better or worse. I think wicked problems, which are problems that don't have one optimal solution because there's so many interconnected tensions, they tend to have sort of like sets of trade-offs that are all good, but can be radically different. So I'm going to offer one that might be a bit extreme, but I think it's an interesting lens to try on. So first of all, I'm working on a tool called Subconscious. I sort of think of it as an internet of ideas. So it's a new distributed hypertext system for note-taking. So you might imagine something a little bit like the web, but radically simplified and specifically targeted to the goal of taking notes. If there's one sort of core idea behind it, it's this notion of self-organizing ideas. So the idea behind Subconscious is you put all your rough notes in a pile and you sort of shake the box, and as you shake it, you know, like you're seeing evolution happening and you're watching sort of knowledge emerge from the bottom up. Now, if you've ever done any study of complex systems and how they emerge and evolve, you know that a self-organizing system requires two things. One is a sort of unit, and another is a mechanism of composition. So to use a non-tool for thoughts analogy, if you imagine like literal evolution, right? Like how we got here. There's this unit called DNA, and there's a mechanism of composition. So you have these DNA strands that can kind of be mixed up. And if you shake that box long enough, you get interesting things emerging with the selection pressure, such as me and you. So that's sort of a basic requirement. It's necessary but not sufficient for self-organizing systems. So there's a challenge here, which we've talked a lot about actually today, which is that prose is difficult to decompose. It has a lot of things sort of like complected within it, right? So there are ideas, they're linearized, which is just sort of one view on ideas. They're formatted, so that's sort of yet another kind of layer of complexion in here. And if you think about something like a book, it's really difficult to kind of unbundle a book, right? There's no unit other than the sort of finished artifact of the book to work with. And so really, if we want something that can do self-organizing ideas, maybe we want something a little more like an index card, I guess, where one unit equals one idea. And actually, there's this quote I keep coming back to, Walter Benjamin, who's like a favorite theorist of mine. He says, today the book is already an outdated mediation between two different filing systems, for everything that matters is to be found in the card box of the researcher who wrote it, and the scholar studying it assimilates it into his own card index. So this is way back in like 1913, 1914 that he's writing this. And this is because it used to be really common. You can actually see a filing cabinet behind him there. It used to be really common for knowledge to be captured on little cards like this. And the process of writing a book was literally sort of taking your index cards, grabbing them, sorting them into stacks, and then, you know, sort of shuffling them until you have a rough chapter outline, and then linearizing it into a book. So we can think of a book as like a zip file, I guess, for index cards, at least a nonfiction book. But even fiction writers like Nabokov would write this way. And it weirdly kind of is a lost technology. We made the jump from index cards to databases, but databases are kind of out of reach for the average person. It's a developer tool. And this is like a social technology that we just forgot how to use. When I imagine what a digital, I guess, index card might look like visually, I guess I picture something like this. I won't belabor this. We've talked a lot about, you know, blocks, but, you know, simple sort of chunk of content with a couple different, you know, types of block, perhaps some text, perhaps some headings, perhaps media, and importantly, for hypertext, transcludes. So a transclude is like a link where you're sort of grabbing all or some of the document that's being linked and rendering it in place. So I'm building this tool for thought in such a way that the data belongs to you or to me. I personally, I love the work that's being done on in this space, but a lot of it is sort of SaaS tools, and I personally have trouble putting my brain on someone else's computer. So one of my maybe ideological kind of motivations here is I would really like something that's just, you know, writing files that I can use and read and maybe even open up in other tools. So maybe the first thing to reach for would be like a text file. You know, could this be our index card? So the thing about a text file, though, is that it has no structure. It's just a string of characters. So this is kind of, from the computer's perspective, one big chunk. That's kind of difficult to work with. Maybe on the other end of the spectrum, we could look at something like HTML. And I think, you know, others have done a better job than I have of elaborating what's complex here. But I'll just point out that HTML is structured. It's a tree. And it's sort of infinitely fractally complex. So you can nest that tree as deeply as you like, and you can use the tags in any way that you like. And that means it's very expressive. You can render many different kinds of things with HTML. But as a structural sort of system, it's quite complex to work with. So imagine taking two HTML documents, trying to merge them. If you've ever tried to do this, or like tried to do HTML scraping, you know, it's a real pain. Everything is possible in theory, but it's sort of a Turing tar pit because the format's just fractally complex. And I just want to make a general design observation here, which is that more structural variation means more context is required to determine the meaning of the document. So when I have a document that has many like sort of layers to it, much depth, many different structural ways in which you can express the same thing. To work with it in software, I need a high degree of context to do anything meaningful. I need like a human complete level of context. And going back to my design motivation here, if I want self-organizing ideas, probably part of that self-organizing loop is going to be about software, working with those ideas, combining them, and creating new variations. So that's a difficult place to start, right? Like if I just have this sort of Turing tar pit of data that's, I need basically human complete context to make sense of. Maybe the next thing to reach for would be Markdown. This is actually my first kind of pass on the problem. And like a lot of you, I have most of my 12,000 notes, I think, are probably written in Markdown. But I, like others here, have discovered some challenges with Markdown. There's actually, it's deceptive, but there's a lot of structural variation in Markdown. Just setting aside the problems of standardization, we have different variants for like basic syntax. We have different variants for links, headings, bold and italic, horizontal rules, and all these things you can sort of consider them semantically equivalent, like a link is a link. But if I read in your Markdown file and into an AST, and that's sort of assuming a lot because most Markdown parsers are just sort of regular expression string replacement. But like, let's say I parse your Markdown into a tree, and then I write it back out, and it munges all of your nice formatting. You're not going to like that. And this is the thing, is that the things like white space, things like these variations and the specific flavors that we all write in are actually an implicit part of the Markdown format. There's a handful of other things about Markdown that are tricky that I won't belabor. I think that atJSON talk did a better job of outlining this, but the no official spec is tricky. If you're trying to build something that is less a proprietary app and more like a standard, you need to have some sort of standardized behavior. And we already talked about text style, syntax variants, but also things like having these many heading levels and list levels is a nice sort of formatting give for publication. But for note taking, you often don't need it. And it adds a lot of complexity when working with these documents in software. For example, if I merge two Markdown documents, do I readjust the heading levels? Where do things go? There's also this challenge that at the end of the day, Markdown is HTML. It's HTML semantics, and there's an HTML escape hatch. You can kind of remove that, but the right way to do Markdown is to sort of bring the whole HTML kit and caboodle with you. So I feel like I like Markdown a lot. It's great for hand authoring HTML, but it would need a sort of overhaul to use as a standalone structural markup language. And at least for the goals that I have, the design goals, it was a tricky place to start. So I kind of, when I face something like this, I like to ask myself, like, is there a way of radically simplifying the problem to sidestep it? Could we imagine a format that's simple for people, simple for computers, and meaningful for both? And then because I kind of just want, a folder full of files that I can work with and other tools, would it be possible to do it in such a way that's easy to read and write as text? So this is the answer I came up with. Again, I would say this is a hypothesis waiting to be tested extensively across, corpuses of notes, but pretty basic, looks a lot like Markdown. But a thing to note here is that it's line oriented. So that means blocks are defined by lines. So one block equals one line. If you want, sort of paragraph levels of content, you just use line wrapping and it's fine. One level of heading, one level of list. Again, this is pretty aggressively sort of Yagni, like you ain't gonna need it. You need all those things if you're publishing something, if you're, creating a book or writing a manuscript. But if we think back to index cards, like these are not really, complex formatting is not really a thing that I write on an index card, right? So what we get out of this is very simple parsing. You can write a parser in like 12 lines of code or less, but you get like some basic structure. You get some headings, you get some plain text, you get some lists. Those are kind of useful. You get some quoted text Most importantly, you get links, and we'll circle back to that. But what I kind of think of this is as my design hypothesis is that this is kind of like CSV for thought, right? It's a very, very simple format. It's super easy to implement. It's super easy to use. It's actually currently impossible to write broken subtext, and I kind of hope to keep that property. Like there are no closing tags to miss, for example. And you can do a lot of interesting things with it, like merging docs because they're flat just means concatenating. When it's flat, you just concat. You can excerpt things by taking the first couple text blocks. You could do something like selecting all quotes from your notes or generating a table of contents from heading blocks. These are all very easy because this just parses to a flat list of blocks with a particular type. You could imagine it as like a JSON list with, you know, an object that has like text fields and a type field, something like that. Most importantly, those links, and you'll notice something interesting. Another kind of aggressive Yagni aspect of this is that there's no inline markup at all, no bold, no italic, but also no inline links. And this is maybe an opinionated bit, but I think text-based linking is in some sense a concession that Tim Berners-Lee had to make to build the web when he did. So the web does not embody some of the ideas that were present in early hypertext concepts, like Vannevar Bush's work, Ted Nelson's work on Xanadu. These all sort of imagined bidirectional links. So they imagined a world where linking might have looked something more like a quote tweet, where you're actually pulling in all or some of the document that you want to link and rendering it in place. So this is kind of an interesting property because now we have this simple, flat structure, but it actually has some very similar properties to a structure that was proposed by Ted Nelson in 1965 called ELF. And the notion behind ELF is that you have these many tiny little idea atoms, thought Legos, and then you compose bigger works out of links to smaller works. And because links are transclusions, they basically just render the content of that atom in place. You end up with this way of being able to compose many different heterogeneous content types into linear narratives. So I'm kind of jokingly calling this maybe Xanadu by way of Markdown. It's a pragmatic hack, right? Like it balances a number of kind of constraints in a way that's good enough, I think, maybe. We'll see in practice. But it does get towards something a little more like this world. So if you are interested in providing feedback, messing around with it, you can find the spec at github/gordonbrander/subtext. And if you want to track my progress on this new self-organizing ideas tool for thought, it's at subconscious.substack.com.
Amazing. Thank you.
I see we have some questions.
We do have a couple of questions. How do you take notes without nested lists?
You know, there might be a few things I end up having to budge on. I suspect, you know, bold metallic and nested lists. I started my note taking using like deep outliners a long time ago. And I noticed over like 10 years that I stopped doing it. Like punch lists are just better, and well, for me anyway. And I find if the idea is complex enough that I need deep outlining, it might be a hint that I need to factor out those sub ideas into a separate note that can be linked. So there are a couple of like really opinionated bits about subtext that I think, you know, you could imagine a different set of trade-offs for, and this is one. Like it has a heavy bias toward trying to get you to factor out ideas into little idea items, or atoms rather, like little thought Legos that are just like one idea big. So the way that you would get, you know, deep nesting, quote unquote, would be to through links. Like links are a directed graph, so you can render them as an outline if you like.
Yeah, Blaine says nested links with transclusions. Right?
Yeah. And the other thing here is that this is intended, you know, CSV for thought is kind of a joke, but also sort of not. It's intended to be kind of like a super simple to work with intermediate format. So like Subtext will render it one way, but it's very easy to imagine building little scripts and other tools or apps on top of it and just visualizing it in different ways, like Kanban boards or outlines or whatever.
Can people basically, there's no release yet. It's subscribe to the Substack is the action right now, right?
Yep, that's basically it. It's too early. So I have a kind of backlog of design opinions, I guess, but that I don't want to commit to before I can build a sufficient number of prototypes to like test them over several different corpuses of notes and get a sense for whether it works. But I think probably I'm hoping pretty soon, like in the next couple of months, I'm going to have like some prototypes I'll be sharing through the newsletter.
Awesome. Do the links work between a handful of text files, or is it all based around a single one?
So this is kind of an area that I'm thinking about. I would actually like to support 3 kinds of links interchangeably. So one is standard HTTP links. The other is, so Subconscious is actually probably going to be built on top of some distributed protocols like IPFS. So I'd like to support other kinds of linking, like other protocols like IPFS. The third, though, is wiki links. So these are just strings of words that the client interprets and as like a link to something local. So you can think of it as like a search string, basically. It's kind of what Jeremy was showing in the double brackets. So the notion would be like you could do an ampersand and write some words, and that would be interpreted as something equivalent to a wiki link in the client. Something I haven't figured out yet is I think it's actually valuable to have multi-source links. This is not something the web supports. But you could imagine having a link that is HTTP, a link that is IPFS, and a client being able to choose whichever one it supports. So I'm thinking about how to enable that in the syntax without opening and closing sort of syntax. One thing I like about Subtext is it's not a deal breaker, but it's actually impossible to break because there are no closing tags. And to get some of those more complex features, I might have to introduce like the concept of closing, which would be unfortunate.
Will F asks, can we define custom line type sigil characters?
Yeah, good question. So the sigil is like it's the first leading character in the line, and that determines the block type. So one way I thought about doing this is you could write a series of alphanumeric characters followed by a colon, followed by the text. And this could be used to mark up things like Q&A, but it could also be used as sort of like a tag or for the block or like a custom sigil type. So we might explore that.
I think the correct answer here is forks and pull requests welcome.
Yeah, that's right. And we actually have an RFC sort of format. So I myself am going through the laborious process of writing out pros and cons and trade-offs of all of these different ideas, because I'm a big believer that design is about navigating sets of trade-offs. And I think you have to kind of like explore the space before you settle on one way.
I'm going to ask Tom's question, and Ethan, I'm going to need to move on to Christina. We might catch yours later. So Gordon, I didn't catch how the self-organizing aspect works. Some kind of NLP.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a combination of sort of what I would think of as game loops in the app, like that carefully guide your input into ways that help combine related ideas together, and also a little bit of lightweight sort of NLP type stuff, but not AI, just like very simple kind of textual analysis, as well as analyzing things like link structure. So you can get a lot of information, like the data can tell an important story about itself just by looking at how things link up together.
Amazing. Thank you, Gordon. Fantastic. Christina, you would like me to bring someone else up on stage?
Yeah, Will F. I think he is in the chat, although there's lots of people, so.
Will F.
There we go. All right. Do I have screen share? Let's see. There we go. Okay, So social roots, this is a completely different kind of a talk.
It's lovely. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a really great thing to end on. I really appreciate it.
The slide that Gordon had with the overlap of the human and computer and the question mark in the Venn diagram is kind of where we sit. So we're building a platform for group-to-group collaboration and coordination, especially on cross-group work, especially on wicked problems, social mess type of challenges like healthcare and climate and whatnot. We are a worker-owned cooperative. So although we very much support the open source world and ethics and whatnot, we have not figured out how to fund that. We are the first co-op that has been funded by the National Science Foundation's SBIR program. So we're super proud of that. And we just got that grant in January, and well, I guess officially in April. And so we're kind of ramping up in research, going through some design sprints, starting to build stuff. And I really wanted to come and talk to this amazing group of folks because we are interested in that social protocol of coordination and where that hits the tech protocol and APIs and ways to be interoperable. Our goals are to help people not only coordinate better where they are, but actually build a tool that leads them to be better teammates. And so my questions are sort of, where do the individual tools for thoughts, the external exoskeleton for your mind type of things need to be brought into a collaborative space? And then what happens to that information as that work is done or the group dissolves or moves on to something else? Who owns that data? And how do we treat that in a way that's not just a raw public-private binary? We have lots and lots of questions, so I just wanted to kind of say these are some of the questions that we're really struggling with. What are the key ways that people understand context as they do their own work together? How do they find that minimum common ground between groups? What and how much information is the least that they can get at to provide context to do work together, especially when you're looking at a lot of cognitive diversity? Where do tools for conversation, which I was just asking, where do the conversation tools and the collaborative work connect with the knowledge garden that, like TiddlyWiki, it's been mentioned a couple of times in the chat. It's very, very interesting and cool, but it's always one person's take on everybody else's stuff, building on top of each other rather than building collaboratively together. And then this final question, I think I alluded to, of how does a group form and dissolve and what happens to that archived knowledge? In terms of the protocols that we're thinking about, we're looking at the feedback loops that we need to build into the tool to support people's ability to do work well together as teams, to address some of the problems that are staggeringly large. Nuanced permissions. So we're thinking of the cell model of semi-permeable membranes. How do we tell, I've got enough salt inside, I don't want anything else, versus, hey, I'm really looking for stuff. And maybe, I have some antibodies to some of the stuff that we may not want in our social spaces. We're also looking at identity in terms of what you do. So looking at the kind of activities that you are acknowledged for, and somebody says, yes, I know them, they do that. Not so much leaning into the reputation space as just like, I did this, I was here. And then the creation and composting, like the feedback loops, we're really looking at life cycle of information and groups. So looking at not only the group as a unit coming together and doing something and then dissolving and moving on and the resources going somewhere else. I think it's very challenging in our mainstream paradigm because organizations really want to accrue resources to themselves at some point. The structure becomes ossified and we just want to do stuff. So how do we can we make tools for thought that allow those structures to form and dissolve without an identity crisis, without a, oh my God, I failed feeling, which I think is very much tied to fear of death. So
I think composting is a lovely phrase, and I think words like digital gardens and some of our history of like 20 years ago wiki usage of the role of wiki gardener all intersect here. So I just want to call that out, and I think I love the word composting. Maybe I don't need these notes anymore. They can go away.
And then the last is just we're looking at what would people building these incredible tools want to see from a social platform looking at group to group coordination. We know we don't want to build a knowledge garden / docs inventory or anything like that. We also know we're going to need to be able to plug in there. And this, I think Jeremy is actually the one who gave me this way back. I love this image of a 3D printed set that makes all of these little Connect tools interoperable with each other. And there was so much Lego in the chat. That's very
well.
sad.
I think we just found an @JSON logo.
So, and Will, I know that you have a lot to add here. Will is our new developer, and I would love to have you say whatever you would like to this group about social roots and the questions that you have from the technical side.
I feel a little put on the spot. I wasn't prepared to.
You don't have to if you don't want to
today. I think I would like to actually just take the time to compose my thoughts and questions, and then share them with you all after the fact.
Thought Legos afterwards are awesome, and yeah, I mean, this is awesome to hear. Even just the thing of thinking of pointing these at wicked problems and social mess goes back to the reason, like, why are we taking notes in the first place? I think a lot of the tools for thought are very single player right now, which is good. But this next step, what I hear you saying as well, I see this a lot where people have personal to-do systems because they need a particular way of doing to-dos for how they work and their personality works and how they mix and match personal and teams and so on. And I think notes are very similar in that way, where then you're going to have to choose or lose some fidelity to choose some group spaces. Right, like those are the trade-offs we make when we're no longer in our own head, basically, right? And the fact that you're aimed at this, that you're a worker cooperative, I don't think, so open source is a license, not a business model. So funding is a separate layer. That's something I give a lot of talks on. I even would like to propose to this group that we experiment with it. So Fission is currently paying for a webinar license to be able to do this with almost 100 people. Yeah, so before I get into that, yeah, Christina, amazing. Thank you so much. Congratulations. So great to share. We've got a couple of questions. Then we'll go into open discussion for a little bit, as long as people can stay.
Thank you.
Thomas asked, how are you thinking about this with, could Asana play a role in here?
So Asana and team task tools are another place where we stop building. Like, what we're building is in between sort of those two things, of the knowledge garden and then the team visible to do. Asana and Jira and that sort of thing are the tools that people are using now who are doing really successful cross-group coordination within an organization, but it's very, very difficult to get somebody to use those heavy-duty tools across organizations on like lightweight partnerships and whatnot. So yes, they play a role, but we're not, that's like, we want to stop at the point where people, start building to-do lists. We're really about the conversations that generate and come out of partnership, and kind of help define those areas where the to-do task boards needs to live.
That's a really great phrase of where the barrier is between those two spaces. Gavin has an interesting one that I think is more general, so I'll skip actually to Ethan. Looking at the life cycle of groups or communities is really great. How do you apply this to apps? Does it imply composting or archiving larger databases? I think of deleting a Discord server for an event that has passed.
Yeah, and I guess that's my question of like, when you delete a Discord server and people have met friends there, they're like, wait, where'd my friends go? And so there's a separation. Well, there's also the question of like, in the whole big Discord server, which, you know, waterfall chats are just horrible for retaining, okay, that chunk of information led this group to coherence and led to an insight, and we captured it somewhere. And so if there's a habit of being able to capture that somewhere, and you know where to find the people, and you don't have a break with the group identity, even if the group is dissolving as that named thing, people still have those relationships. And so people are very loath to delete chat servers because of that. So yeah, that's where our questions are. I don't really have any answers, but
I've gotten the sense through a lot of this that we have to actually go back to our roots, social roots, and do various things like maybe some sort of capturing of social graph that's user-centric and not trapped in servers is something we need to work on. But
yes.
All of these are themselves wicked problems. And when you say things like Asana or Discord, it's like, oh, right, those are closed protocols run on other people's servers. Oops. But again, maybe something like atJSON as some export so that some of those things could be rehydrated in the future, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like this idea of the social conversation turning into an artifact that somebody else in a you know, coastal community dealing with the same kind of thing could go and see how they solved it. I love that. And I think it needs that layer of annotation on top of it to bring that minimum viable context to the humans. Yeah,
amazing. Before I kind of go, we've got a few more minutes. I think we're going to keep another 15 minutes at least to do some group discussion and figure out what to do next. So socialroots.io, what else do you need? Where should we go? How do we help? Christina.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
Yeah, socialroots.io. We're a tiny team right now, and we are just getting started. Sign up for early access, and we will give you something to play with, hopefully by the end of the summer. I'm really easy to find on Twitter, csageland. And I think team at socialroots.io if you want to get in touch directly. And really those like, I would like to know from a platform that is endeavoring not to be a walled garden, through really legal means, more than technical means, because we're taking the worker co-op route. What kind of APIs would you want? What kind of protocols should we build into? Like really some of the technical questions that you hope that we really take a look at as we start to build. Because first we have to just design the experience, and then we go, okay, now we have a wireframe we can build into, and we'll ask those tech questions. So
amazing.
That's it.
Maybe that might even be you know, a dedicated thread or some discussion forums. You know, that's kind of my vision for this, is that we can interchange as humans as well. So we'll see what we can do there.
Awesome.
Thank you, Christina. Again, amazing. And thank you everyone for that. I am going to very quickly share my screen so that we have a few things up on screen. So we have another one of these that will be next week, June 3rd. So a Thursday or a Friday, depending on where you are in the world. And in fact, we're going to bring in Ian Neal, who's in Australia, to do an overview of standoff editor concepts. It should feel very similar to a bunch of atJSON things, So some of those discussions will be like, can we literally use atJSON for standoff editing? And then Brian Rubinton from Canopy is going to talk about his tool, and Frode Hegland, some of his stuff that he's doing. So excited to bring some of these other things on. If you haven't already, you can register there. We'll send email out to everyone of follow-ups. I don't need to leave that up, but I just wanted to show it briefly. I've already dropped a link. Actually, I did create a new organization on GitHub with sort of minimum viable format. I think what I'll do is I'll export the chat, which has amazing links in it. I don't quite have the tools to turn it into an atJSON file, but maybe it will end up as a subtext file. And I'll commit that to the repo. And then we can use that discussion format to have to ask questions and work together. We've already pointed at a couple of spots, right? Like who wants to work at ePUB and atJSON? My personal bias is that we work on this a lot of different ways. So one of it is open source for sure. So as in that has at least two meanings. One being collaboratively working together on solutions in a distributed open format like some GitHub repos. And secondly, it means choosing a license, which to me is less important these days, other than it needs to be relatively available for folks. I think a third piece is I'm a huge fan of open collective. So even doing some things in there, like if people are interested, let's put an open collective up, let's pass the hat and say, we want more convening like this, and pay for a few bits and bobs, like some domain names and Zoom accounts and stuff like that. So please do get in touch if that's something that you're interested. I'm openly asking of who wants to continue the Tools for Thought speaker series, essentially. I'm happy to help. Fission has some resources that can put them at hand, but this needs to not just be the Boris show, although I'm happy to be a catalyst for things. Other questions here, panelists, I want to give you a chance, like some closing thoughts, other things that you want to say, share to people. Would you come again?
May I just say that I'm thrilled standoff markup is making a comeback as well in so many ways. So this is like a Ted Nelson hobby horse with Xanadu for ages, but I think it's like the way forward if you actually do need deep sort of manuscript level formatting. It's such a great way of doing interchange. So really excited to see the work on atJSON.
Yeah, I was going to say the stuff that Gordon's working on is super awesome. It sort of addresses a lot of the complications that we found with Markdown. Like, I mean, I think you spoke really well to that. And it's like, if you can simplify the problem, there's a really nice approach there. And then when you get into more complicated situations where you're like publishing glossy magazines, we kind of have to figure out actually good ways of thinking, because we spend so much time building parsers over and over again that don't get us closer to the goal. So this feels really really exciting to have this community. So yeah.
Fantastic. I know we've taken a lot of time, so I'm going to start by hitting stop on the recording and just one more thank you to all of our panelists and attendees and the amazing engaging chat. So valuable. So we will see you at the end of this video.